Hello, my name is Himanshu Shekhar. I work for New Delhi Television, NDTV India. I covered Kashmir floods last year, devastating floods in India's border state, Jammu and Kashmir. And my presentation is based on my experience of what I saw in Jammu and Kashmir last year. I wish to present here a new idea, and the idea of a right to compensation in disaster laws. I think the state has a constitutional responsibility to protect the lives of its citizens, to ensure that its citizens live in an environment which is safe and secure. I'm not going to elaborate on this idea of right to compensation in disaster laws based on what I saw in Jammu and Kashmir, which is a very sensitive border state. I wish to start with a few images of what had happened in Kashmir, just to give you a perspective. This is one of the first images of the Jammu and Kashmir after the flood waters had entered Srinagar and other major cities. And you can see the devastation which was caused by floods in this state. It is considered the worst floods ever to hit Jammu and Kashmir in last 100 years. And from these images, you can understand how devastating the impact was. These floods marked a watershed in the history of disaster management in India. These floods also exposed the fault lines in the state's disaster relief and response mechanism and highlighted weaknesses in India's disaster management strategy. Considered the worst since 1902, these floods destroyed 2.5 lakh homes and made millions homeless. The plight of lakhs of flood victims made the Supreme Court to intervene, and on the basis of which I'm raising this question: should the existing disaster management law be amended to give victims of natural disasters a legal right to compensation? Just a brief introduction about how India is a high disaster-prone country. 58.6% of the landmass is prone to earthquakes. Over 40 million hectares prone to floods and river erosion. 7,516 kilometer long coastline India has, of which close to 5,700 kilometers, that is more than 75% of India's coastline, is prone to cyclones and tsunamis. 68% of cultivable area vulnerable to drought and hilly areas are at risk from landslides and avalanches. India is also part of Asia-Pacific region, which is world's most disaster-prone region, where 40% of globe's natural catastrophe occurs. So you can understand how sensitive this subject is for India. In last 30 years that the assessment has been made, 1981 to 2011, India was hit by 431 major disasters, resulting in enormous loss of life and property. According to the Prevention Web statistics, 1,43,039 people were killed. So that shows the large scale of devastation and how much India has actually suffered from natural disasters. And there is also a huge economic loss that a poor country like India has suffered. According to a World Bank study, India lost about 2% of its GDP between 1991 and 2005 alone due to disasters. There's a huge economic loss that disasters can actually force upon a country. It is ironic that India is a very high disaster-prone country, but the first attempt to make a legislation on disaster management was made only in 2005, which is 58 years after independence. And the focus was to change the response of the Indian state from a state which was earlier reactive to a relief-centric state system. The shift in focus from a relief-centric approach to a more proactive prevention, mitigation, and preparedness-driven approach in 2005. But now I am going to show you how serious questions have arisen after the Jammu and Kashmir floods and what the images that you just now saw. Now, Kashmir, again, I'll just repeat, worst floods since 1902 in Jammu and Kashmir. And you can see that above normal rainfall was 2,953% in Shopian district alone, and 1,410% above normal rainfall in Srinagar. If this is how this is the abnormal level of rainfall that falls upon a city, then is it possible to do any kind of preparation in advance to protect people? That's a larger question that we face today. Some more images of the city after the flood waters had entered the capital city. Good thing was that because of prompt relief and rehabilitation action, 287 people died. In normal situation, one would assume that a tragedy of this scale would lead to large human loss. But thousands of villages were destroyed, 2.5 lakh houses destroyed in Jammu and Kashmir, which is a very huge figure. These are official figures from Ministry of Home Affairs. All major hospitals were underwater. There was a fear of epidemic loomed large as dead bodies of animals floated in stagnant flood water for days after floods had hit the Kashmir Valley. I saw many dead bodies of animals floating in the canal adjoining the Jawahar Nagar locality, which was underwater when I reached there. And the state government had no wherewithal to deal with the threat it posed to hundreds of families living in open makeshift tents along this canal. Now, just few meters from where these makeshift tents were, there were dead bodies of animals floating in the canal, and there was no effort to clean up these canals because they didn't have the manpower to do it at that time. And from secretariat to mobile towers, from power to gas supply stations, most critical infrastructure laid submerged in water for days. And when this is the level of water in a city, you can imagine all critical infrastructure would be destroyed. Nothing was working in Kashmir, in flood-affected areas at that time. Now, these are one of the first images of people trying to run away from areas where flood waters had entered Srinagar city. Another image. This is another image of that. People are just trying to walk out of the water. At the moment, the relief agencies have not yet reached them. These are one of the first images of what had happened. And what happened later was one of the biggest relief and rescue operations launched ever in Jammu and Kashmir. 2.9 lakh people were rescued, and Indian Army deployed 30,000 troops with 17 choppers and 224 boats. Indian Air Force deployed 30 transport aircrafts, 53 helicopters to air-winch flood victims. So these are figures just to show how, at such a large scale, the relief and rescue operation had to be started. You can see the soldiers in these images who were one of the first to reach to help people on the ground in far-flung areas. And you can see how to protect 3 people. There are 4 to 5 soldiers in one image alone. So it was a Herculean task for the security agencies. But the larger question that arises from Jammu and Kashmir floods is that it exposed the fault lines that exists in India's disaster management strategy. These unprecedented floods, they showed that the existing disaster response mechanism in India was ineffectual. There were questions also about the poor implementation of the Disaster Management Act, even 10 years after this law was passed by Parliament. And the mandatory legal provisions of the Disaster Management Act were not implemented on the ground. I will briefly tell you there were sections in the Disaster Management Act under which state governments were supposed to act, take preventive action, but these actions were not taken. And there was no mechanism to regulate the movement of traffic or public in flood-affected areas, which is very crucial. And large number of flood victims had no access to shelter and clean drinking water. Thousands of flood victims we saw were living out in the open, on the roadside, with small children, old people living out, forced to live out on the roads because their homes were completely submerged under water, and there was no alternative mechanism in the city to take them to shelter. This is the image which will tell you how difficult it was to launch relief and rescue operation in that area, and the scale of devastation that a floods of this kind can actually unleash on a city, and how much difficult it would be to protect people in these situations. These are again manually people being taken out from far-flung areas of Jammu and Kashmir by soldiers. And there were warnings given earlier by National Institute of Disaster Management. They were not taken seriously by Jammu and Kashmir state government, and they paid a heavy price for it. Now, this devastation and the fact that the relief and rescue did not reach hundreds of thousands of people led the Supreme Court of India, which is the apex court of India, to intervene. And Supreme Court very categorically said that the calamity and disaster as huge as this deserves a national response. Government of India may consider forming a unified agency for proper coordination of rescue, relief and rehabilitation operations. Apex Court also constituted a special 5-member committee to assess the damage caused by floods, and the Supreme Court appointed body also, when they went to the ground to study the ground reality, they raised serious questions. There was serious delay and there was anger among the people because thousands of people did not get any relief and rescue in the first week after the flood waters had entered their area, and there were anger was shown on helicopters which were dropping relief material. The stones were pelted at them. The boats of rescue agencies, they were attacked by the people. And this struggle of the common people, of the common citizens of Jammu and Kashmir for immediate relief, rescue and compensation leads us to a larger question, which is the central idea of my presentation, that should the Disaster Management Act be amended to give the citizens, the disaster victims, a legal right to compensation. Now, the next question that arises is, should uniform national standards for grant of compensation be codified in the Disaster Management Act itself? The disaster management law in India at the moment doesn't specify any timeline for the grant of compensation to disaster victims. So, should there also be a fixed timeline for fixing the quantum of compensation to the worst affected disaster victims? This is a question which I think every country in the world which is disaster prone must think about seriously, that should there be a right to compensation to disaster victims codified in their national law, which will make the state more accountable and which will make the system more accountable, so that every single affected person is given a right to livelihood and a right to reconstruct his or her dwelling at the shortest possible time. So a rights-based paradigm for grant of compensation to disaster victims, very important. Everyone in the global community must think about it. We also have to define how we can define compensation in the law. This is a question of debate. The identification of beneficiaries, very important. How do we identify who needs how much of compensation? Is a complex legal question. We have to brainstorm on that also. A right to reconstruct dwelling and recreate livelihood opportunities, I personally think, should be a must of any right to compensation paradigm. And a more accountable and transparent system which respects the right of every citizen to seek relief and compensation is very essential. And I think every country in the world which is disaster prone must think of a rights-based paradigm of granting compensation to people who are badly affected by disasters, especially natural disasters. Okay.
I come from the state of California in the United States, and the quality of the schools to resist earthquakes in our state took a huge increase when the members of the school commissions in each city were held accountable and legally liable if a school fell down and they had been notified that it was vulnerable. So this is a complementary proposal which has worked in California. There was a huge increase, not by giving compensation, but by holding officials, as you claim here, who were aware of a danger and did not act. And I think this should too also be considered.
That should be a test case which should be propagated in different parts of the world to show how it is very essential that as the threat of climate change is posing to the global community, it is very important that every country in the world comes together and makes the system more accountable. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. How the life went back again in terms of reconstruction of the village or city?
Right. Please repeat your question.
Yeah, I said how people come to life again in terms of reconstruction. Yeah, the area or the city.
Yeah, I think I'll just take 30 more seconds. It essentially started with the security agencies entering into the disaster-prone areas, and they first rescued people, took them to the safer zones, and once the water level receded from the areas which were under flood waters, then the process of sending all the disaster victims back to their homes started actually. Thank you.